We are here to talk about Blitzscaling, Reid and Chris's new book that just went on the shelves yesterday, as a matter of fact. So congratulations to both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of having an advanced copy of the book, and I will tell you, it really resonated with me on a lot of levels in my experience in early stage companies, as well as Airbnb in the last 7 years. They definitely, I can tell you, I wish I had had that book walking in the door at Airbnb 7 years ago. So before we formally start, I do want to give a special thanks to Reid, who, while we didn't have the book in those early days, we did have Reid as a very close, trusted advisor to Airbnb. So thank you for everything you've done to help Airbnb.
Pleasure and honor.
And so let's get started. With that, thank you, and a very warm welcome to you, Chris. I'd love to just jump into questions. I'd really love it to be a conversation. I will start with questions, and then we will have questions from the audience as well. So let's start with the why. Why did you and Chris write this book?
So 2013, 2014, I was on a panel in Europe where we were asked what was special about Silicon Valley. And the reason why this question is asked is Silicon Valley has 4 million people all in, and that's a tiny fraction of that is in the tech industry, and yet roughly the amount of massive tech companies that come out of this are just enormous. Half of the kind of a public market value in recent tech creation has emerged out of Silicon Valley. And the story that is usually given is a startup story, which is tech entrepreneurs, a culture that allows risk-taking, technology companies, venture capital, tech universities. You put them all in a soup and you take enough shots on goal that these great emerging companies kind of go to global scale. And yet that exists in lots of places in the world. It exists in New York, it exists in Berlin, it exists in London, it exists in Dubai. That entrepreneurial culture and those ingredients are all these places, and yet still many of these companies come out of Silicon Valley. And so I was like, well, that's a necessary but radically insufficient component. And actually, in fact, what Silicon Valley's been learning has been, how do you build these companies at speed to global scale? And what are the set of techniques that you do in management, in recruiting, in go-to-market, in business model, in risk-taking, in capital deployment in order to do this? And so we were like, okay, well, let's actually, in fact, try to get that out there. And that's essentially both what led to the book and also the podcast, Masters of Scale.
Mm-hmm. So who is the intended audience for this? Who will benefit most from reading the book?
So I would say that we wrote the book for a series of audiences. The first audience, of course, are the entrepreneurs who are looking to do this, the Blitzscalers. They're tackling a really tough, really uncomfortable process. I think you felt that yourself. And we wanted to give them as much help as possible. Airbnb has been lucky enough to have Reid as an advisor providing advice for the past 7 years, but we haven't yet figured out a way to clone Reid and place him in every company. So this book is an attempt to do that. But beyond that, the thing about Blitzscaling is it is shaping our future. It's shaping the companies that are going to provide the jobs of the future, and those companies are shaping the landscape of our lives. And so whether you're a person who might want to work for one of these companies, or a government that's attempting to figure out how to deal with their presence in your in your country, or if you're just an individual consumer whose life is touched by all these companies, everyone should understand how these things work.
Mm-hmm. And how is it that you two met, and how did you collaborate on the book?
So the story actually goes all the way back to when Reid was starting LinkedIn. And when Reid started LinkedIn, there were 3 social networks that came out at that point in time: Friendster, Tribe, and LinkedIn. Some of the older people in the audience may actually remember Friendster and Tribe. Well, Friendster, for those of you who may recall, was for single people looking for dates. And I was already married, so that was out. Tribe was for people who were like in a motorcycle gang or something like that, and that wasn't me either.
Or going to Burning Man.
Or going to Burning Man, which I eventually did, but many years later. And then there was LinkedIn, which was for professionals who wanted to connect with each other. And I said, wow, that looks like the one for me. And I signed up almost immediately. I think we looked it up later. I'm user number 3,000 overall at LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. And because the founders were all Stanford alumni, I just reached out to them and said, hey, I really love your service. And I was an early enthusiast. I brought Reid in to speak at events. And my great regret is that I was not yet at that point making any investments in companies, because I have a feeling that investment would have done pretty well.
All right, well, let's dive into the book. You start the book in the introduction with actually a story about Airbnb.
Yes.
About 2011, when we had a very significant competitive threat coming out of Europe. And you explain that blitzscaling was really the key to our survival in those early days. So what exactly, how do you describe blitzscaling, and why is it so important?
So the compact description of blitzscaling is prioritizing speed over efficiency in an environment of uncertainty. That's the compact. Now, what it really means is, all right, the thing that most matters is we get our product and service to scale, to lots of customers, and we do it as fast as possible. And we're willing to spend capital inefficiently, we're willing to hire in undisciplined ways, we're willing to ignore many of the tenets of management, in terms of, well, figure out your customer acquisition costs, figure out your long-term value, figure out your unit economics, do one-on-ones and detailed performance reviews and all this sort of thing. You ignore all that because it's the speed to scale. And the reason you do that is because in the modern kind of hyper-connected world, more of these markets are what we call Glengarry Glen Ross markets. First prize, Cadillac. Second prize, steak knives. Third prize, you're fired. So first to scale really matters, and that's a set of things you do. And so the part of the reason we opened with it was such a canonical case where Airbnb and kind of, okay, we're working out all the details and we're growing at the fastest rate we can, but within a very disciplined hiring and everything else. Oh gosh, we have a seriously funded competitor in our primary market of Europe that's threatening to drive us out of that market. What do we do? And most often in blitzscaling, it's a response to either a real competitor or a competitor that might be coming. And that's the reason, because it's the first to scale that matters. And that's, of course, the reason why we opened with the Airbnb Wimdu example.
And so, as I was reading it, I was thinking about, did we think we're going to prioritize speed over efficiency in the face of uncertainty? No. I mean, we didn't have that framework, and we certainly didn't know the word blitzscaling, but that's what we were doing. So, but how do you expect founders to use this framework? Would you then say, okay, and recognize a moment of time where you have to make that decision to prioritize speed? Is that the idea? Versus other types of scaling, which maybe we can go into those other.
Yeah, and there's like fast scaling, which is doing it with more of an emphasis, still speed, but an emphasis on efficiency. The key reason to kind of do the book, and then Chris will add some to this, but the key reason to do the book is to say, okay, let's realize that all of a sudden we're going to be taking a bunch of risks, raising a bunch of capital, growing the size of the company, trying to get spread into a market before we understand things that MBAs and business school professors would tell us, oh, we should really understand those before we go. And we need to do that as a company. We need to do it as a group. So we need to be coordinated, understanding what the weirdness of what we're doing. And that's part of the reason we put in, like we have a section on, counterintuitive rules, embrace chaos, tolerate bad management, be embarrassed by your first product release, right? All of these things, because you go, oh, if we expect and understand that as a company we're going, then we can do it a lot better. And the book then allows us to go, okay, we're going to do the embrace chaos one. This is the way we're going to do it, and we can coordinate better. And that was part of the reason to encapsulate that information, because part of the mission that Chris and I want to do is to say the more areas of the world that can actually build this next generation of massive and transformative company creates more economic prosperity, creates more jobs. I think the jobs will be created by going into the world this way. And so how do we enable that in more places out of the things that we've learned in Silicon Valley?
Mm-hmm. And one of the things we try to address in the book is also this notion that blitzscaling is just the same thing as in the dot-com boom saying get big fast. The whole point about blitzscaling is it's taking calculated, intelligent risks. And so the entire first section of the book is laying out a framework for evaluating the blitz scalability of a company. So you know whether or not your business model is one that should be blitzscaled. Because if it shouldn't be blitzscaled, then blitzscaling can rapidly become blitzfailing.
Well, that's great. I like that.
We trademarked that one.
Well, and I do want to go into that, but before we get there, what are the other types of scaling? Because not every startup scales like Blitzscaling. So, and how is that different?
So if you guys were to picture a 2x2 matrix, and I love using 2x2 matrices because I did go to business school, and that's what they teach us to do there. But if you do a 2x2 matrix based on speed and efficiency, and certainty and uncertainty, you can actually divide it up into 4 quadrants. And the first quadrant is when you are proceeding very efficiently in an uncertain environment. And that's what we call the classic startup scaling. And startups do this because when you get started, there's so many unknowns. And you try to be as efficient as possible. You try to bootstrap. You try to learn as quickly as you can, but not spend money along the way. And if you're lucky, you start to get some results in. Maybe you've got some user adoption, maybe you've got some revenue. And as you proceed from uncertainty to certainty, you may then say, well, we're going to continue growing, and we'll just do traditional scaling. We're going to grow efficiently. We're going to grow using revenues. If you then say, well, you know what? We have an opportunity here. Let's raise money from outside investors. Then you might emphasize speed over efficiency, but still in a certain environment. For those of you who are investment bankers, there might be a few in the audience, you're very happy to help people raise money if you can write an equation that shows that this company is guaranteed to make money. And so that leaves the 4th quadrant of blitzscaling, which is, wait a minute, why are you going to prioritize speed over efficiency in an uncertain environment? It's very counterintuitive. But in many cases, as we'll discuss tonight, it actually is the best strategy.
So Reid, as an investor, which is the preferred model from your perspective? If you can't put everything in a blitzscaling high-risk company, so how do you think about the...
Well, the preferred model is the companies that have massive growth. And the reason why the blitzscaling quadrant is interesting is that if most other investors and most other competitors don't actually drive in that arena, then you actually have an opportunity to go be the first to scale, because you can take the risk. And this is actually one of the more subtle advantages that Silicon Valley has, because subtle but very important, because a lot of investors will go, okay, we realize that pouring in a bunch of money into a company that actually can't prove its customer acquisition cost, can't demonstrate what its unit economics are, doesn't really have a clue about what their long-term value is yet, although you can throw some theories and models against the wall. And yet you can go, well, but actually, in fact, when we do that, sometimes we emerge with these massive, highly valuable companies. And so we'll do that here because we think the talent's here, they know how to do it, et cetera. And if you're the only people who can blitzscale and other people don't, then you can go claim these opportunities first. So it isn't that you're only looking for blitzscaling opportunities as an investor, but you're looking for the highest probability shot for creating Airbnbs, Facebooks, LinkedIns. That's the thing that you're looking for. And there's always a risk coefficient, and sometimes they don't work, and sometimes people think they've got something that they should blitzscale that doesn't work. And the funny thing is, when I watch some of the outside commentary in Silicon Valley, I'll take one that was commented a lot that I thought was idiotic. There was a company called Juicero, and it was like, we're going to scale this juice company. I was like, well, I don't know who's really thinking that's a good idea, right? And they say, and that's why Silicon Valley is foolish. And actually, in fact, what's happened since the internet boom to now is it's learning, well, which one should you blitzscale? Well, actually, in fact, things that are more software based, things that have network effects, things where you can, you may not know if it's a good or a great business model, but you can tune it. And those things, when you get to scale first in a really decisive way, create massively valuable businesses. So those are the kinds of things you look for as an investor.
Right, and the book goes into that, some of the factors where you can tell if a company is blitzscalable, and some of the limiting factors. What are the limiting factors?
So the key limiting factors we talk about are, one, product market fit or lack thereof, and the other is operational scalability. And you can see the cautionary tales out there. There was just an article being written about Groupon, as a matter of fact, and I often use Groupon as a cautionary tale of a company that had almost everything going for it except for product market fit. So quick question, how many people here have ever used Groupon? Go ahead, raise your hand. Okay, fantastic. How many people here have used Groupon in the past month?
Yep. Oh, I can't.
Oh, wait, I see 2 in the back.
Oh, yeah, there's one over there.
But here's the thing about Groupon. Groupon, it has a lot of the things that we look for in a blitzscaling company. It's got an enormous market. It's got great gross margins. It's got incredible distribution. It's got network effects that make it a Glengarry, Glen Ross market. The only problem was you as the consumer didn't want to use it, and then the merchants who tried it discovered it was terrible as well. And so as a result, a lack of product market fit means that you don't have sustainable success. The other thing, of course, is operational scalability. We've talked about it on the technology side with Friendster. Friendster failed because the pages took 30 seconds to load. Guess what? No one was willing to put up with that.
You can drive the entire network off your service if you do something like that.
And the other side is operational scalability. It may be sometimes it's the human operations. Can you hire enough people? Can you find enough people? And so these things need to be overcome in order to blitzscale.
So let's go back to network effects, because you've both mentioned that. The book talks a lot about it with companies like LinkedIn, Google, Amazon, Facebook. So first of all, I mean, maybe talk a little bit about what network effects are and why they're so critical to be able to blitzscale.
So the classic understanding of network effect is where each new person in a network, each new entity, each new node in a network adds superlinear value to the network. And a classic way of understanding it is like fax machines or telephones, because the more folks that you actually have all engaged in using it, the more that actually, in fact, it becomes a critical part of infrastructure that's really helpful for how you navigate your life or work and so forth. And obvious examples of communications products, instant messenger, social networks, these sort of things. Marketplaces are another key one because of how you match buyers and sellers. And the network effects create a really kind of a vibrant business that then begins to get its own inertia and is a way that you can frequently build a lot of interesting products on top of it. And so it isn't the only thing that you would blitzscale or the only thing, but it is one of the things that experienced Silicon Valley investors look for intensely and try to find as many of them as they can.
So once you get that flywheel going from network effects, and it's kind of a winner-take-all model, can you lose it? And how do you ensure that you don't lose that network effects in that place?
Well, some of the stuff that Chris was saying earlier is like, for example, in the Friendster case, is if you say, well, we fail to upgrade our technology in a way that like the whole network turns it off at the same time. That's definitely one way you can do it. It's like, because you're not going to wait for 30 seconds for a page load on the internet. And then also, of course, if you didn't actually have product market fit, a la Groupon, really there, like sometimes this is actually one of the things we cover. This as one of the things that you pay a lot of attention to in a kind of a blitzscaling environment is your growth coefficient masking massive churn? Because if you're getting that kind of massive churn, then you're not having product market fit, and then in fact you blitzscale and then you fall over. And you actually want to blitzscale and then have a thriving ecosystem.
Yeah. And one of the examples I use is I tell people, you want to know how powerful network effects are? How many people here have bought something off of eBay? How many people here have done that? Okay. How much has eBay changed during the time that you've been using it? Changed some colors, right? And then Craigslist, some of you may have used Craigslist at some point in time, they don't even have graphics to change. So network effects can be so powerful that fundamentally the core product can remain the same for years or even decades and still be incredibly compelling. Now don't do that, right? Continue to innovate. That's the thing you should do, but that illustrates the power of those network effects.
All right, so a question for both of you. The business models, and you talk about innovative business models in the book, and then you talk about proven business models. So what are some of the businesses or business models out there right now that you're excited about? Maybe Chris, you can go first.
So I think that in honor of your being on the stage, I think it's absolutely clear that the marketplace model is one of the dominant business models of our time. It has those strong network effects, and especially because the internet, what marketplaces have always been powerful. Just think of your local farmer's market or swap meet or what have you, but those were local network effects. What the internet has done is has allowed all these marketplaces to become global. And that makes them really exciting for investors. And it makes the transaction so much easier to handle as well.
There are far fewer global network effects companies than local network effects companies.
Very true.
Yes. And the other thing is, part of this, of the learnings that Silicon Valley has, is even though there's really valuable business models and subscriptions, and that's fine because it gives you recurring revenue, investors really like it, public markets really like that, freemium models are very strong because the free part of it allows you to get a very wide funnel of adoption. It's actually one of the things that's required for things like virality, which you see in Facebook and LinkedIn and others. And that freemium model then can combine the value of a subscription model together with a very broad distribution.
With the example being Dropbox, which has these incredible business characteristics where each cohort of new users is worth more a year later than they were the previous year. And that's just amazing.
And platforms are another one. Do you want to say a few words about platforms?
So the key to a platform is that a platform is like a network effect, right? Each additional thing you build on top of it becomes more valuable. And I think that, Reid,
Think iOS, Android, et cetera.
You sit on the board of a company that is a platforms company. Maybe you can comment on that as well.
Well, when you sit on a public board like Microsoft, you don't actually comment on the thing as much. But yes, look, platforms create network effects because it's like, well, user one uses apps, or user A uses apps 1, 3, and 27. User B uses apps 2, 3, and 32 and 64. But all that together means that, okay, I'm locked in with this set of apps, whether it's iOS, Android, Windows, and that means that this is the platform I'm going to be using. And that creates a network effect.
Right, go from app to platform.
Yes.
And then if you combine a platform with a marketplace with digital goods, and maybe a subscription.
Yes. Digital goods is another one of the innovative business models that usually plays within the freemium side.
So the 3 techniques in the book around blitzscaling, one is innovative business model. We've talked about that. The other is strategic innovation or strategy innovation. And that really is blitzscaling in and of itself, right? Because blitzscaling is a strategic choice to make. And so we've talked a little bit about when a company should blitzscale and maybe why a company should blitzscale. When does a company decide to stop blitzscaling?
So blitzscaling is primarily driven by competition, right? This goes back to the Glengarry Glen Ross. It's how do you get into that first position? And the primary thing where you would kind of elect to stop blitzscaling is you say, all right, now using the techniques we've gotten here to get to this a competitor couldn't do that. They might have a different path. You always have this possibility of having a market shift, a new entrant, a new competitor that's doing a new, different thing using mobile versus desktop. You know, these kinds of things as ways of doing it. But on my path, on the path that we've taken as a company, we've established that space. We've claimed that land. Now there can be other nuances too. So, for example, usually blitzscaling is done by raising capital from markets. Sometimes capital markets dry up and you say, okay, well, we need to shift to being more efficient with our capital. It's, you know, sometimes an issue. Since blitzscaling is relative, it's kind of a question of, well, what do you raise in capital relative to your competitors and what do you do in speed relative to your competitors? But that could be another thing as well. And then sometimes, by the way, you'll also realize that the path that you're on, actually, in fact, some of your theories about how you could establish your business or fix your business turn out to be wrong. And then you actually have a serious rebuild.
It seems like something that you only realize upon reflection. Okay, there's where we slowed down and there's where we started to care more about efficiency. So for example, in LinkedIn, when was the moment where you stopped blitzscaling, and at that time, was that intentional, okay, we're gonna shift here?
Oh, well, it wasn't, I don't know, there wasn't now we're doing it, because by the way, I also coined the term blitzscaling, developed the framework, looking back on what we had done on LinkedIn. And part of the reason for writing the book, adding it into the kind of the business practice of how we operate, is to have people make more of a conscious decision on that. Mm-hmm. Like it could be something that, you know, the exec team would be sitting around saying, okay, I think it's time now to change tempo from this to this. You know, and it doesn't necessarily mean it changes all on a dime, but we're going to move more towards focusing on efficiency in hiring, efficiency in management process, efficiency and customer acquisition, like as opposed to just raw speed in order to get there. And I actually think that for LinkedIn, it was probably around, the thing that probably actually triggered it was the launch of the Facebook platform, because we were still saying, well, we don't know how easy it would be to build or replicate LinkedIn in other ways, and so we're still going out to try to establish the whole network and moving as fast as possible. And when Facebook launched its platform, F8, there was a whole bunch of press saying, oh, LinkedIn's dead now, and the LinkedIn competitor is going to be built on Facebook, and there were teams inside LinkedIn that worried about that. And so about 3 to 6 months after that, we realized you couldn't build LinkedIn on the Facebook platform, and that meant we actually had this fairly unique space within the professional market. And we knew that in part because one of the ways, and this is kind of a classic technique that you do within Silicon Valley and blitzscaling companies, is I had actually taken kind of one of our top kind of product management teams and top engineering teams and set them to work on building LinkedIn on top of Facebook platform, right, in order to see what the pattern would be and if it was possible. And that team ended up building an app, because we were playing with the platform, seeing which things would work and so forth, called Bumper Stickers, whose primary use was teen girls slapping stickers on each other's profiles, which was great, but wasn't LinkedIn.
So should a public company be thinking about blitzscaling? There's a lot of risk and uncertainty, and so how do you advise public companies to think about this?
Well, of course, it always depends on the particular opportunity. But let me describe a public company to you, and you guys can tell us whether you think it ought to blitzscale. So the public company I'm thinking of, it would have 17,000 employees and a market cap of $20 billion, and have been around for over a decade.
And a really established business.
Really established business, dominating its market already. Does that sound like the kind of company that should blitzscale? Well, maybe not, right? It's like, well, they've already gotten pretty big and they dominate a particular market. Why would they want to keep growing? Well, the company I just described to you was Amazon in 2006, when Jeff Bezos introduced Amazon Web Services. And there's actually a Business Week cover with Jeff Bezos on the cover. He had a little more hair and smaller biceps at that point. And the headline of the story is, Jeff Bezos wants to sell you computing services, but Wall Street thinks he should just mind the store. And the article is about why it's such a terrible idea for Amazon to launch Amazon Web Services. And of course, if you looked at that and said, yeah, you know what, those Wall Street guys are right, there's no more blitzscaling to be done here, you would have missed out on well over $1 trillion of additional wealth creation. So Amazon Web Services reveals that if you find an innovative business model, an incredible market, you have this opportunity. Even if you're already a publicly traded company, you can blitzscale.
And then
Interesting.
As a follow-on to that story, Satya Nadella at Microsoft sees that and goes, we need to build Azure. And so they similarly say, and they said, okay, well, we're going to build our own version of how the cloud. We're going to do a hybrid cloud, which is a combination of on-premise and cloud, because that's what enterprises want. But we need to go do that as fast as possible. And so, for example, in classic blitzscaling, you start building data centers, even though your data centers aren't profitable yet, because you need to be out there, you need to be establishing customers, you need to be learning from it, you need to be improving and learning how to do your unit economics and what the platform is for doing this hybrid cloud. But that was another example in the same market.
So I wonder, as you're talking, is blitzscaling kind of the new, more modern answer to innovator's dilemma?
Well, it's one of them. I mean, the classic kind of, it's a pattern by which your innovations matter, because the innovations that matter are the ones that get to scale. And so again, it's Glengarry Glen Ross. The first to scale is the thing that really matters, and then that establishes the ecosystem.
And many of the recommendations from the innovator's dilemma do apply to blitzscaling in large organizations. So we talk about a number of companies, be it Android at Google or what have you, where in fact the blitzscaling business was largely separated from the main business and allowed to grow semi-independently. And this was an important part of being able to allow the blitzscaling team to really focus and blitzscale.
So that was another question. You can have different parts of the business in different types of scale mode, if you will.
You generally need the CEO and the exec team to buy into it because you're taking some major risks, capital allocations, everything else. And then you need to be able to make sure that that group can function with enough vigor. So like another one was Android at Google. It's like, okay, when they were establishing it, in order to get that built out and have another entrant within the mobile OS thing, literally it was only people who were working on Android whose badges would get them in the door, right? In order to focus that group on that.
So we've talked now about innovative business models, the strategy, and now I'd like to turn to kind of the management innovation. This was actually my favorite part of the book because the transitions, the rules, the counterintuitive way to think about how you grow a company in those stages is, again, you reflect back and you go, oh yeah, that's when we went through that transition. But maybe let's start with leadership because the founders, as they adjust to a blitzscaling environment, how is leading a blitzscaling company different than leading one of the other types of companies that at scale?
Well, let's come at that at an angle, because one thing, I suspect that few people have, other than you, obviously, have read the book yet.
Well, it came out yesterday. They had all day. I mean, come on, people.
Precisely. Part of what we say is the anchor for how these companies change and how the rules of how the company operates, including management change, is it goes through these orders of magnitude of number of employees. Right?
Stages.
Yes, exactly. Right. So it kind of starts at the family stage and goes all the way up to the nation stage, which is like tens of thousands each level. And part of what happens in this learning of blitzscaling is understanding how that you're going to be going through these stages very quickly. Like frequently, these blitzscaling companies are doing something like doubling their employee base in 3 months or 6 months or 12 months. And that's havoc on an organizational chart and coordination and so forth. And so what the idea was to say, well, look, here's a set of what the must-dos are: establish company culture, breed some tolerance for chaos and for tolerating, suboptimal management in terms that we put it as tolerate bad management because it's more tweetable. But like for example, not doing one-on-ones and just kind of focusing entirely on the work and not on like career progression and growth. And we did all this because we wanted to get people to say, okay, here is how I know that are the few things that I need to focus on, and here's a bunch of stuff that I can fix retroactively as we're going into it. And part of what that means when you're looking at managers and leaders is you're saying, okay, I'm not trying to build the one perfect company. I'm doing this thing where, like, one of the metaphors that's used in Silicon Valley frequently is I'm replacing the jet engines while we're still flying. Like, I'm just changing this fundamental stuff around as we're making it happen, and that's what we need to be doing. So for leaders, you need to be learning the new game. You need to say, well, what got us here isn't necessarily what's going to get us there on a wide variety of fronts, and I need to be constantly learning what the new game is. And I need to be willing to adjust my team a lot, because while this person may have been the perfect person to head product at, the village stage, that when we get to the city stage, they're no longer that person. Now, and then part of the techniques and the hacks in the book is to say, well, but they may still really want them in the company. And so the way that you make promises to employees in a blitzscaling company is not, oh, you're going to be head of product forever. You're head of product now. You'll be head of product as we grow. The commitment you make is, as you succeed in your job, you will have more and more responsibility, and you will have a bigger job with more impact each year, but it won't necessarily be the head of product, because as you get to each of these stages, usually you're trading off, it's at least half of your executive staff as you change, because it doesn't mean that they all leave, but it means that the composition of the exec staff is different. And, for example, what happens is a company like Airbnb looks around and goes, oh my God, Belinda's really good. We should promote her, right? And
give her that thing and that thing too.
Yes,
and
exactly.
That other thing.
Right, and that's the kind of thing that is the way you do that. I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add.
I would just add to summarize it, one of the things that we talk about in the book, and a phrase that you coined, is that blitzscaling leaders need to become infinite learners. And the reason is that as you go through each stage, from family to tribe, from tribe to village, village to city, city to nation, you're effectively running a different company each time. And you have to learn so quickly in order to outpace the growth of the company. And so the CEOs and leaders who are most successful at it are people like your founder, Brian Chesky, who reaches out to the most interesting people in the world, the experts who can help him think about these issues, and internalizes that and then turns around and is able to apply that at the company.
He is definitely a master at that. There's a number of transitions like that listed in the book. There's one that, in particular, I found interesting, which is generalist to specialists. So that when you start a company, you hire a lot of people that do a lot of different things, and that over time you have to obviously hire more expertise, and that can have an impact on early employees. But the thing I've noticed in the early stage companies that I've been with is that is one of the hardest transitions to make, where the company starts to slow down, even though you still think you're blitzscaling, because suddenly you could make a decision with just 2 people across the room, and suddenly now you have the CMO and this expert and that expert and all sorts of stakeholders to weigh in on every decision. So how do you advise companies to get through that and so that they can continue to move fast?
So the first thing I would say is, in addition to hiring specialists as well as generalists, you're changing the way you're running the company. So if we think about these stages of company, family, which is 1 to 9 employees, tribe, which is 10 to 99, these are informal cultures, and they're run based on consensus. They're run based on everyone sort of weighing in and saying, here's what we need to do, and I think we should do this, and I think we should do that. And that's a part of what makes them so fun. I actually enjoy that stage the most if I'm an operator. But then beyond that, you need to transition into a formal culture. You get to be a village, which is 100 to 999 employees, and you can't know every single person in the company.
By the way, these are rough numbers. The exact precision is not the point.
Yes, exactly. We just make it powers of 10 because it's easier for the sake of explaining it. But as you transition from an informal to a formal culture, all of a sudden you need to begin establishing new norms for how decisions are made. And that may include not necessarily having every single person in the company give input.
And this happens so fast. That's the thing, in a blitzscaling environment, suddenly you were making 1,000 decisions a day, and then suddenly and you have to be really attuned to saying, okay, we now need to shift how we operate.
And part of, I mean, look, and Airbnb does this very well, but part of what you do in order to maintain the blitzscaling, the speed, even as you get a more formal culture and more large in terms of how you're operating, is you stay on a very, like, look, here are the key OKRs. Here is the thing we're trying to achieve. And we're willing to have some sloppiness on this and this. We want to figure out how to do customer service well. We want to figure out unit economics well. We want to figure those things out. But we're not like do or die by the end of the year. Those things have to be perfect. The thing that we're saying is, no, we need to be in these markets. We need to be, because part of being the first to scale is you're the first one learning the markets. You're learning what is the right product market fit. You're learning, and then you're tuning your product to that so that you can establish it. And that's why the speed to scale matters so much. And you can, even in a village or next level up city and the nation, even in those you can be doing it, but your coordination pattern's different.
And there's one more transition that I wanted to ask you about, which is the transition from pirate to Navy. Can you say more about that and maybe use some examples of companies that have gone through that transition?
So this was a metaphor that was just too juicy to resist. And it just makes sense on so many levels. So first of all, Silicon Valley has always had a thing for pirates. Steve Jobs, when he started the Macintosh, said, you know, it's better to be a pirate than to join the Navy. And this whole notion of swashbuckling, it's very romantic. People get very into it. But what does it really mean? Well, what we tell people is piracy does not mean just breaking laws left and right and pillaging and like mad. In fact, you can be an ethical pirate, which simply means that you are very flexible, that you are very willing to take risks, and that you're very informal and not really bound by rules.
I think you called it a lovable rogue.
A lovable rogue, like Captain Jack Sparrow, if you will. But that even...
Who would have thought Pirates of the Caribbean as a model for entrepreneurship? But yes.
But even if you're a lovable rogue, as your company grows in size into a village, a city, a nation, that informal style no longer serves the company well, no longer allows the people within the company, your employees, and the customers of the company to feel like, okay, we know what's going on. And at that point in time, you need to be a much more formal culture. You need somebody who's much more like a Navy admiral or somebody like a Captain Picard from Star Trek.
And so we wrote an essay.
Patrick Stewart's a native of New York, isn't he?
And so we wrote an essay describing that where Travis Kalanick worked at Uber and where it failed, and then why Dara is actually, in fact, doing a very good job of now shifting the pirate culture into a Navy culture.
Mm-hmm. But what struck me is the companies that are pirates versus Navy are following a different set of rules. And so as you realize it's time to shift to a Navy environment at a company, how do you keep those pirates from sailing past you? Because they are not following the same kinds of rules.
Well, you want to get to a place where you have such a good establishment of product market fit, you have a natural demand. If you have network effects like Airbnb does, it's a very natural place, such that if a pirate came and started doing the same things that you had done to establish, didn't matter anymore. You've established your market, right? So like in the LinkedIn case, it was like, well, you know, we invented some of the techniques that were like, okay, you want to know who else is on LinkedIn, you know, upload your address book, see who else you know who's here, do that. Well, that no longer could be the pattern by which you would establish a competitive product to LinkedIn, right? And so we don't, you know, we can then tune off our Blitzscaling process to more efficiency, more, you know, you spend more time doing, you know, focus groups, you know, understanding the qualitative side of things because you have the time to do that and to wrap that loop back into what you're doing.
Yep,
those are the kinds of things you change.
That makes sense.
The other thing you can do, if you're a Navy and you're dealing with a bunch of pirates, maybe they're very promising pirates, is you then recruit them into your Navy. You make them a part of the company. And the master blitzscalers often figure out how they can use things like M&A to actually not just head off these threats, but co-opt them. So if we look at Facebook, for example, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg have been masterful at this. The acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp, which seemed so expensive at the time. Wow, $1 billion for something that launched 18 months ago, $16 billion for a messaging app. Now they look like bargains.
Okay, so you also describe a number of counterintuitive rules around blitzscaling that seem kind of crazy, but when you unpack them, they make a lot of sense. So one of your rules that resonated with me was kind of let fires burn. In those early days, people used to ask me, what's the most stressful thing? And I would say, it's not the speed that we're going, and it is not making 100 decisions a day. That's actually a good thing. It's that you know there's this out there, and you know you can't deal with it, and you have to get a mental note to go back to it, and you have to decide what you're going to focus on and what you're not. And that really is an underlying stressor that I think most people don't. It's not intuitive to understand that that's an issue. So some of this let fires burn. Can you talk about that more?
I'll combine that with another one of them, which is ignore your customers, right? Which is another one that's on it. And I'll do it from an early story at PayPal, which was PayPal had found a product market fit of enabling credit card payments to work on eBay. And in the early days, it was growing at a compounding rate of between 2 and 5% per day. Now, payments is one of the things where enough things go wrong, and it's dealing with people's money, dealing with exchange of goods, that people want to have that sorted out. And so rapidly, within a couple of weeks, it got to the point where enough customers figured out that PayPal was in Palo Alto, which was the only place we had a listed phone number, because we didn't have a customer service phone number or anything else, was dialing the main number and dialing extensions at random, that 24/7 you could pick up any desk phone and talk to an angry customer, right? And so we did that sometimes in interviews. Say, oh, you want to know how underwater we are? Pick up that phone that sounds silent, because we turned off all the desk phones and used our cell phones as a way of doing that. And you say, okay, well, we had one person. One of the funny things was, because we were an early stage company, And our office manager came to us and said, we have an angry customer who's hammering at the door. Can you go talk to them? And I was like, okay, let me get a couple people, so there's at least 2 or 3 of us. And the point of it is say, look, we could have stopped everything, locked down, tried to fix our customer service, allowed less transactions, everything else, and we might have died as a company. Because the thing that mattered was getting to the scale. And so as much as we felt the pain, we obviously didn't want to have a customer service nightmare. We didn't want to have a low NPS. It's those future customers. It's the much larger scale thing that matters. And that's the thing that we had to build towards. So the fire that we were letting burn, because we literally said, okay, we're doing nothing about the current customer service problem, but what we are trying to do is figure out how do we jump ahead of it. And we said, okay, let's go open a customer service center in Omaha, Nebraska. We'll get the governor and the mayor to say, hey, the internet's coming to Nebraska, and they'll help us with all a bunch of television and everything else to do interviewing. We flew a third of the company out on the weekends, and we interviewed people in groups. Like, okay, we're gonna interview these 20 people at the same time, and we're gonna interview these 20 people at the same time as a way to try to figure out in order to jump ahead of it. But while we were doing that, we were letting this massive fire burn, which, by the way, could have been a total disaster mistake, and people could have stopped using you, and we were ignoring your customers, our customers.
So, Chris, you had another example, or the book has another example about letting fires burn, saying distribution is a more important fire to fight than product or revenue model. Another kind of counterintuitive notion.
So one of the things that happens in Silicon Valley is people talk about, oh my God, the most important thing is the product. You got to build a killer product, you got to build a killer app. And people look at Steve Jobs and his example and say, if I just build the most amazing product in the world, success is going to come. But if you consider blitzscaling and you consider the network effects that are associated with being the first to scale, really, distribution kind of is your product. Distribution is the thing that improves your product. And so it's actually more important to solve the distribution problem right away than it is to be the best possible product. A great product with poor distribution will lose to a good product with great distribution if there are network effects involved.
Especially because once you get the distribution, you're learning from the market, you can improve your product.
That makes sense. So let's move away from Silicon Valley for a minute and talk about other industries where, not just consumer internet, but what other industries might you think about blitzscaling?
Well, I think it can be any, because it's a competitive speed. Now it tends to be more software, tends to be more things that you can move really, really fast in. Software, consumer internet being one of those. You want to talk about Zara?
Absolutely. We were on the streets of New York, and I pointed out over in the corner there was a giant Zara store. And Zara is actually an example of blitzscaling, just in fast fashion. And the reason it's an example of blitzscaling is it's because it's a company that has focused on an innovative business model that has prioritized speed over efficiency. So what Zara does is, Zara is the fastest of fast fashion retailers. And their core innovation relative to competitors like H&M and The Gap is they don't make clothes that people don't want to buy. And the way they do that is they get input from the store to the designers the same day. So when people in the store say, this is what people are buying, the designers design more of it, they ram it into production, and they can have new clothes into the stores in less than 2 weeks. All of their manufacturing still takes place in Spain, not the most efficient, cheapest place to manufacture. Everyone else manufactures in China and Indonesia. But by manufacturing in Spain in highly automated robotic factories, they are able to get clothes produced and anywhere in the world in 48 hours. So even though they're doing things in a way that seems inefficient, the additional speed it gives them allows them to become probably the dominant player in their industry.
And the Obama campaign is another example that you mentioned in the book. Do you want to talk more about that? That's really interesting.
Absolutely. So obviously, we know now that Barack Obama won 2 terms as the President of the United States. But when he set out to run for president in 2007, he was a heavy underdog. Right? Everyone said Hillary Clinton is going to win the nomination. There's no chance that this freshman senator is going to win the nomination. But what he was able to do is to develop an innovative business model for a presidential campaign. Presidential campaigns had a typical way they worked, which was You get a bunch of big donors and they bundle together contributions because people can contribute a maximum of $10,000. I think that's what it was at the time. And that's how you fund your campaign. And the Obama campaign had the good fortune of recruiting one of the founders of Facebook on board. And they started building out online infrastructure. And of course, what ended up happening is the Obama campaign flipped that on its head. Instead of getting donors to max out their contributions, they got thousands of times more donors to make small contributions. And those little $20 contributions meant that by the end of the campaign, the Barack Obama campaign had raised more money than any other presidential campaign in history.
And the other nuance here is they also did a very good job of motivating lots and organizing lots of volunteers. And this is a model that doesn't just work on political campaigns, but for example, another of the Blitzscaling companies or organizations that we talk about is based here in New York called Crisis Text Line. And part of what Crisis Text Line says is, all right, we're going to use technology to make it really efficient of, teens and other folks tend to text, not call. They still have these, kind of, issues where they need help. We can use technology, the network of texting, artificial intelligence and machine learning in order to help that, and then a massive network of volunteers in order to provide scalable mental health help and routing help all across the country.
I think we're getting close to time, but I do want to go to China for a minute, which you call the land of blitzscaling, and it does go so fast. As an executive team, we took visits twice, and every single company there told us, if you think Silicon Valley is fast, it's nothing. This is fast. And so what are some of the lessons we can learn from China and how they've blitzscaled?
Well, so we blitzscale a little differently, and we can't do it exactly the way they do it because there's ways they can do it that are not available to us. So like Lei Jun, who is the CEO and founder of Xiaomi, which is a mobile phone company, was sitting with me years ago, and he was like, oh, you Silicon Valley people, you're lazy. And I was like, what? He's like, well, our policy, and this was when Xiaomi was 30,000 people, and it's much larger now, is 996. 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, you're discoverable at your desk. Right? That's harder to do here. You can do it when you're 20 people, 50 people, right? But as you scale to 30,000, it doesn't work. And there's a bunch of other stuff by the availability of large labor pools. Frequently, one of the techniques that the Chinese companies work is they'll just start 5 different groups working on the same project. And they'll go, okay, the one that works, that's the one that's going to actually dominate. But we'll have 5 different groups working on the same project. Whereas when you have a smaller number of employees, you just don't have the kind of resources in order to be able to do that. And so those are ways that, actually, I'll give you a LinkedIn example that was really funny because, so I have a certain amount of experience as an investor and so forth. And so our head of LinkedIn China was showing me some designs for the launch of LinkedIn in China in Chinese, and this product called Qi2 that we'd launched. And he's like, okay, we're going to have this launched in 8 weeks. And I looked at it, and I'd seen a lot of these kind of pitches within Silicon Valley. And I was like, oh, no chance, right? Like, you're not going to have this launched in 8 weeks. He's like, well, look, it'd be really helpful and motivational if you came back in 4 weeks and met with a team and talked with us about some of the design decisions we make, and we're going to be launched in 8 weeks. And I said, all right, fine. I like the fact you're aggressive. You're really going to get the product out there. I came back 4 weeks later, and what he had done is he had taken the product engineering and design teams and essentially moved them to a hotel. And it was 2 weeks on, 2 days off, 2 weeks on, 2 days off. And the only thing they were taking breaks for was food and a little bit of exercise and obviously sleeping in the evening.
Wow.
Working that.
Showers too, I hope.
Yes, well, that would sleep, shower. They launched in 8 weeks, right? Really stunning. It was like one of the things where I went, ooh, I've learned something here. This is interesting. Now, at Silicon Valley, there's ways that we learn to say, okay, how do we leverage the network for getting intelligence, for making decisions, so you don't have to put as much raw energy, so you're more on target. Depth of technology investment in platforms. There's a stack of things, so we're not out of the race. But in terms of the raw aggression and raw speed, China's the fastest in the world.
I think we could probably have a whole session on just China alone and learnings, and I'd love to dive into that. But I'm going to go to the questions from the audience. So here's the first one. it sounds like blitzscaling can be very expensive. How do you size an investment in blitzscaling?
So you are taking risks, and part of the venture model is sometimes you lose money, all of it, sometimes. And so, but what you do is you say, okay, how much capital is worth deploying to get to the next major milestone that can tell me whether or not I'm going to actually be able to create something, I have a higher shot of creating something massively valuable, and that it will be valuable. At the very early stages, when you do like a Series A or Series B, like when I was investing in Airbnb, you can build all these models saying total addressable market and value, and it's one of my favorite expressions is, in theory, there is no difference in theory and practice, and all these models are theoretical, right? And so, but then as you begin to get, a sense of these things, like for example, take the growth of Uber. It was like, oh, it's not actually in fact just an alternative black cars, it's actually transportation logistics, and the whole market's going to grow. Airbnb, right? This is a broad space travel experience platform, not just kind of a low cost alternative. And as you begin to get that, then investors go, oh, now it's worth, even though it's still risky, it's worth a much bigger slug to pay for this much, to get to this much bigger outcome. And so the ranges go through, starting with a Series A at 5 to 10 million, a Series B at 20 million, a Series C at 50, a Series D at 100 to 200, and sometimes you even go faster than that. And that's the way you do it. Now, it can be very expensive. These companies can be, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in capital, and it can still be. You don't really know how big it's going to be, but you get a better visibility on what the risk bet looks like.
Now, just because it's such a fantastic story, I would love for you to talk a little bit about the decision-making process when you brought Airbnb to Greylock and you said we should do this deal.
Well, that was very early in the Airbnb thing, and so there wasn't
even before my time.
Yes, it wasn't a lot of data, but. Well, there's a funny lesson, which someone had told me about Airbnb a year or two earlier, and they'd pitched it entirely wrong. They had said, this is a way that people can rent out their couches. And I went, oh, that's totally an uninteresting business, right? And so when Brian and Joe and Nate had been trying to get on my calendar, I was like, oh, I'm not interested. And it was hard for them to get on my calendar initially. And finally, someone I trusted called me and said, they're really great founders. You should really meet with them. And I was like, okay, fine. And I think we brought them by on a Sunday afternoon. And I was sitting there, and they literally opened with, well, here, it's a marketplace for space, and it works the following way in travel. It was the 2 or 3 months in, and I said, pause. Okay, I already have a reference from you about how good you folks are. I understand this. I've looked at the product. I'm going to make you an offer to invest. Let's take the rest of the pitch session, and let's make it a working session, right? Because I actually want to work on it. It was great.
That's a great story.
Yes.
I hadn't heard it quite like that.
Yeah.
That's good. So a few more questions here. A group of us here are from Oscar Health, a health insurance startup scaling big time.
Yep.
We have an awesome culture at our company, but what is your advice for maintaining culture, this is a good question, and employee engagement at fast-growing companies in tough industries?
So the really key thing, and Chris may add some stuff in, the really key thing is to be very decisive and directive about the culture in a way that it spreads horizontally, not just from management down, by which everyone does that. And then it's okay to use formalisms, the Netflix culture deck. What we did at LinkedIn was, in all of the conference rooms, we boiled down the culture to kind of 6 statements, and we put them on the walls in the conference rooms so that when people were talking to each other and making decisions, anyone could reference, and no, we need to make the decision this way because of that, right? One of the super cool things that I learned from Airbnb was designing all of the conference rooms in a model of some of the most interesting Airbnb properties around the world, because it reminds you viscerally, this is what we're about. This is the thing that we're doing.
We have photos of our hosts all over the walls.
Yes.
We come to work every day for our hosts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of things, and it may feel a little artificial, but it's worth being really rigorous and systematic in the adoption.
and a couple of other hacks that we ran across in our research and talking with people. One of the hacks is culture interviews, and I believe that Airbnb still does this, as a matter of fact. So the key with culture is you're not just looking for people who are exactly like the people you already have. That is a foolish approach and is going to lead you into trouble. What you should be doing is looking for people who can add to that culture. But the issue is, when you're blitzscaling, you're desperate. You just need someone in. You're already working harder than a Chinese person, and you want some help.
Or the same.
Or the same.
Yes.
And you want some help. And so what Airbnb does is it actually has a culture interviewer who's looking for how does a person add to Airbnb's culture. And that person cannot be the hiring manager, cannot be in that chain of command, because they have to have the freedom to say, no, this person doesn't actually add to our culture, regardless of how desperate they are to get that person in.
And we actually have 2 core values interviews for that. And the founders used to do every single one of them themselves. And I remember when we had to go, this is not working anymore, and came up with the idea that we would go through training for people that really understand the values and the culture of the company so that they could also be interviewers for that.
And I think Oscar may be bigger than this already, but we found this very strange and interesting fact. There were many companies where the founders had been a part of that hiring process for every employee through number 500. And that came up 3 or 4 times. That one number was the one that kept coming up.
With the feedback loop of helping teach the whole team of this is what we're looking for in the cultural interviewing.
And there was something very cool that Anil Bousri said, which is he said, you know, when I see the employee and I'm not hiring them, I'm hiring them and the additional 100 people they're going to hire and their people are going to hire and so on and so forth. And that really puts into perspective what kind of a decision it is to bring someone into a blitzscaling company.
It's a great question. Okay, here's another. To be successful in business and life, what would you say to a high school student that is what is the most important character trait to develop?
Well, so my first book, The Startup of You, is everyone needs to be the entrepreneur of their own life. And it kind of takes the advice that I give entrepreneurs and boils it down to an individual. And there's a set of different chapters in there. I'd say probably the most important thing is to think that life is a team sport, not an individual sport. And so be very conscious about the team that you're building, because they also help make you stronger, open opportunities for you. You kind of work together, and there's a way of thinking about it. But there's a whole stack in that book.
And I agree with that. I'll add something in a very different direction, which is I think that one of the core abilities you need to develop is the ability to view reality as it is. I think that it's often very easy for people to view reality as others say it is, or to view reality as they want it to be. But the ability to actually say, okay, this is what's actually going on, to know who you are, what your place is, what your assets are, what you can do, is so critical. And if you're able to develop that as a high school student, I think you're vastly ahead of most people.
Okay, excellent. I think we have time for just one more question. How do you marry blitzscaling and speed with hiring effectively and not having the wrong people bring down your company? I think it's a little to the culture discussion that we had before.
Well, one of the things that you learn when you're blitzscaling is you try to, of course, get the initial core network as solid as possible, because that, the hiring happens. It's like not just the one person, but that one person brings in 100. And you will get to points where you have errors and misfits. And so one is you try to have a very strong initial network. You try to have a good systematized process, cultural interviews, whatever. So a bunch of different ways to try to make that happen. And then you often have to be very disciplined about, okay, this is a misfit. This doesn't work. And actually, one of the discoveries of the Stanford class that Chris and I did when we first set out on kind of generating the book was how the Netflix culture deck came about. Because I had actually thought, Reid Hastings, a friend of mine, I thought he was, he's an awesome founder CEO, very direct and smart about culture. And I thought he had thought strategically about, we're going to codify our culture into this deck, and we're going to publish it to make sure that the people coming in, it already had a sortal effect of the people coming in. I was like, it was that master strategy plan. So I'm sitting there doing an interview like this one, and I asked Reid, so tell me about your strategy with this. And he was like, strategy? What are you talking about? And I was like, what? He said, well, we were figuring out like which people bounced the most, like what was the patterns of the people who bounced in the first 3 to 6 months. And we realized that the primary thing was actually a cultural fit. And because they came in expecting something different than what we are. So we said, okay, well look, as part of onboarding, we should make that more helpful. So let's create a culture deck to explain to people as they've walked in the door and as they become a employee, look, here's who we are. You don't have to go discover it in the next 3 to 6 months. We're telling you right here. And then once they did that, they said, well, wait a minute. We shouldn't wait until they're walking in the door. We should tell the world about what it is so people who want to work here with the right fit come, and people go, oh, that's not me. Don't even bother applying. It's much better. And that's how the Netflix culture deck came about.
Well, to build on that, though, because blitzscaling is, you have to have a certain ability to cope with that kind of environment, I'd say. So embracing chaos and doing things that are counterintuitive. How do you screen for that in an interview process for someone that would be able to cope with that?
Well, you have to have, look, part of, like, for example, an interview question I use a lot is, because it's part of getting to infinite learners, is one component of that is a person a systemic learner? Like, for example, you say, oh, what's a project that you undertook? If you could call yourself before you took that project and tell yourself what to do differently, not here's the lay of the land. Yes, yeah. And then, because what you're seeing is, do they learn explicitly? And one is, that shows that they're a learner, but it also shows that they learn in a way that they can spread that to a team. They can collaborate. They can tell other people about it. They can help their team spread those learnings. And of course, part of learning is not just what you learned historically yourself, but what you're learning as an organization and how that works. And so that would be an instance of kind of how do you interview for the learning characteristics, which are central to succeeding in a blitzscaling company.
Makes sense.
And I will tell you that Reid lives this, because the very first thing he's going to ask when he walks off this stage is, what could I have done better? And everyone who knows you knows that's the very first thing you're going to say.
Not how did I do? That's a useless question.
Nobody ever says, oh, you sucked out there, my God.
So any closing thoughts before we end the evening?
So I would just say that being here in New York as part of the launch week for this book has been a fantastic experience for us, seeing the receptivity that people have to these ideas. And we just encourage you, hopefully you're going to go home, you'll have time to read the book, share it with others, because we think these ideas are really important and that they're ultimately going to be something that helps the world.
And I've heard about the 92nd Street Y for a long time, and it's a real honor to be on the stage. Thank you.
And thank you both. Thank you.